Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. Today we're going to be discussing the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by Professors J.Mearsheimer and Stephen M. Walt. This book was written in 2007, but it's probably been never more relevant than it has been in the last year since October 7th, 2023. And although Professor Walt is also one of the co-authors, you probably have heard about Professor Mearsheimer because he's, let's say, much more public. He does a lot more interviews, he does a lot more speeches than Professor Walt does. But whenever I'm referring to them, if I accidentally refer to just Professor Mearsheimer, know that I mean to include Professor Walt as well. I actually did a video on this last year. I'll put a card to it, in which I talk about the fact of Israel and the U.S. sharing values. And that takes a different look at it. What I've decided to do in this video is just to look at 5 takeaways. There's many more than 5 takeaways in the book, as you can see from the markings, but I just wanted to keep the video shorter and focused on particular things, which I think are relevant, particularly since October 7th of 2023. So the first key takeaway is that the lobby exists. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is factual. AIPAC brags about it on social media, their influence. It is not anti-Semitic to say that there is an Israel lobby. It exists, and they know it exists, and they talk about it. And it has really far-reaching influences. So, let's talk about some of those influences. AIPAC's success is due in large part to its ability to reward legislators and congressional candidates who support its agenda and to punish those who do not, based mainly on its capacity to influence campaign contributions. Money is critical to U.S. elections, which have become increasingly expensive to win, and AIPAC makes sure that its friends get financial support so long as they do not stray from AIPAC's line. This process works in several ways. To begin with, many of the same individuals who bankroll AIPAC are often important political contributors in their own right. Using data from the Federal Election Commission, the journalist Michael Massing found that between 1997 and 2001, the 46 members of AIPAC's board of directors gave well in excess of $3 million in campaign contributions, and many of them remain generous donors to pro-Israel PACs and candidates today. Since 2000, the Washington Post reported in 2004, AIPAC board members have contributed an average of $72,000 each to campaigns and political committees. Second, AIPAC helps connect political candidates to other donors and sources of funds. Despite its name, AIPAC is not a political action committee and does not officially endorse candidates or give money directly to their campaigns. Instead, AIPAC screens potential candidates and arranges meetings with potential donors and fundraisers, and provides information to the growing number of pro-Israel PACs. According to the historian David Bial, the American Jewish Israel lobby has developed since the Six-Day War into one of the most sophisticated and effective lobbying organizations in the United States Congress. It has done so in part by developing a national network of Jewish political action committees for contributing funds to congressional candidates based on the criterion of support for Israel. As AIPAC President Howard Friedman told the organization's members in August 2006, AIPAC meets with every candidate running for Congress. These candidates receive in-depth briefings to help them completely understand the complexities of Israel's predicament and that of the Middle East as a whole. We even ask each candidate to author a position paper on their views of the U.S.-Israel relationship, so it's clear where they stand on the subject. Israel's predicament. Friedman's description of AIPAC's modus operandi is consistent with testimony from other political figures. Tom Hayden, the anti-war figure who was running for a seat in the California Assembly in the early 1980s, explains how he won support from the local power broker, Michael Berman, on the condition that he would always be a, quote, good friend to Israel. Hayden, who won the election, notes that he had to be certified kosher, not once, but over and over again. The certifiers were the elites, beginning with rabbis and heads of the multiple mainstream Jewish organizations. An important vetting role was held as well by AIPAC, a group closely associated with official parties in Israel. When necessary, Israeli ambassadors, consuls general, and other officials would intervene with statements declaring someone a, quote, friend of Israel. Hayden, one may note, merely held state-level offices in his political career, although he was unusually visible in that role. Think about that, that to run for a state office in California, you need to be labeled a friend of Israel, as if the state of California has an official policy that can affect what goes on in another country. In the same vein, Harry Lonsdale, the Democratic candidate who ran unsuccessfully against Senator Mark Hatfield in 1990, has described his own visit to AIPAC headquarters during that campaign. The word that I was pro-Israel got around, he writes. I found myself invited to AIPAC in Washington, D.C. fairly early in the campaign for, quote, discussions. It was an experience I will never forget. It wasn't enough that I was pro-Israel. I was given a list of vital topics and quizzed, read, grilled, for my specific opinion on each. Actually, I was told what my opinion must be and exactly what words I was to use to express those opinions in public. Shortly after that encounter at AIPAC, I was sent a list of American supporters of Israel that I was free to call for campaign contributions. I called, they gave, from Florida to Alaska. Again, does this sound like a conspiracy theory to you? These are just people reporting what happened to them, and they're not hiding it. They said, I'm pro-Israel, and this is what happened to me when I declared that I was. What happens if you don't do what the lobby tells you to do? Perhaps the most renowned example of the costs that can befall a politician who crosses AIPAC is the defeat of Senator Charles Percy in 1984. Despite a generally pro-Israel voting record, Percy incurred AIPAC's wrath by declining to sign the AIPAC-sponsored Letter of 76, protesting President Ford's threatened reassessment of U.S. Middle East policy in 1975. He also made the mistake of calling PLO leader Yasser Arafat more moderate than some other Palestinian terrorists. Percy's opponents in both the primary and general election in 1984 received large sums from pro-Israel PACs, and a businessman from another state, Michael Goland, who was also a major contributor to AIPAC, spent $1.1 million on anti-Percy advertising in Illinois. Goland was later convicted of making illegal campaign contributions in the 1986 California Senate race. As Tom Dine boasted after Percy's narrow defeat, all the Jews in America from coast to coast gathered to oust Percy, and the American politicians, those who hold public positions now and those who aspire, got the message. Again, does that sound like a conspiracy theory to you? These are direct quotes. Dine's hyperbole notwithstanding, the basic lesson of these cases is hard to miss. As J.J. Goldberg, the editor of The Forward, said in 2002, there is this image in Congress that you don't cross these people or they take you down. J.J. Goldberg is writing about this. This isn't, again, a conspiracy theory. It's not hateful anti-Israel rhetoric. It's simply facts. You don't have to like the facts, but facts are facts. The bottom line is that AIPAC, which bills itself as America's pro-Israel lobby, has an almost unchallenged hold on Congress. One of the three main branches of the American government is firmly committed to supporting Israel. Open debate about U.S. policy toward Israel does not occur there, even though that policy has important consequences for the entire world. As Senator Ernest Hollings noted as he was leaving office in 2004, you can't have an Israeli policy other than what AIPAC gives you around here. Another senator, speaking on condition of anonymity, told a Washington Post reporter in 1991, my colleagues think AIPAC is a very, very powerful organization that is ruthless and very, very alert. 80% of the senators here roll their eyes on some of the votes. They know that what they're doing isn't what they really believe is right, but why fight on a situation where they're liable to get beat up on? Small wonder then that former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, and war criminal, once told an American audience, when people ask me how they can help Israel, I tell them help AIPAC. His successor, Ehud Olmert, agrees, remarking, thank God we have AIPAC, the greatest supporter and friend we have in the whole world. So, quoting Ariel Sharon, quoting Ehud Olmert, is this a conspiracy theory? Is the Israel lobby a fictional idea conjured up by, I don't know, right-wingers, left-wingers, who whatever wing is going to say that the Israel lobby is a thing? People have tried to deny that it even exists. It clearly exists. There are testimonies given from people who've taken money from the Israel lobby, and then people who've been defeated by the Israel lobby. You can either believe them or not. You can believe they're part of a giant conspiracy theory, But for those who are interested in looking for the facts are there for you. Just that most people are not interested in the facts. They're interested in just listening to whatever they're told to believe. The second takeaway is that without U.S. aid, Israel would be forced to make peace with its neighbors, and they would be forced to actually deal with their economy. Because they get weapons, because they get loans, because they get direct aid from the U.S., Israel can do whatever they want. They basically they spend like a trust fund kid who likes weapons. And the U.S. always backs them up. The U.S. gives them loans. The U.S. gives them aid. And it is endless. And I think whenever I read these numbers, keep in mind, these numbers are old. This is from 2007. It's only gone up. And there's only been more money given in almost the last 20 years. Obviously, as I'm recording this is 2024, but it'll be 2027 soon enough, and Israel funding will continue on. That is part of the dogma of the United States. Unconditional support of Israel is a pledge that every political candidate has to take in the United States. And so these sorts of aid packages, which I'm going to read to you, are going to continue indefinitely. I don't see any reason why they're going to be stopped. But again, these are facts, not conspiracy theories. So before people get triggered in the comment section, please explain to me how these facts are not facts. In terms of the absolute amount of U.S. aid, however, the real sea change took place following the Six-Day War in June 1967. After averaging roughly $63 million annually from 1949 to 1965, more than 95% of which was economic assistance and food aid, average aid increased to $102 million per year from 1966 to 1970. Support soared to $634.5 million in 1971, roughly 85% was military assistance, and more than quintupled after the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Israel became the largest annual recipient of U.S. foreign assistance in 1976, a position it has retained ever since. Support for Israel shifted from loans to direct grants during this period. We're not even going to pretend that they're going to pay this back. With the bulk of U.S. aid consisting of military assistance rather than economic or technical support. According to Clyde Mark of the Congressional Research Service, the official research arm of the U.S. Congress, Israel preferred that the aid be in the form of loans rather than grants to avoid having a U.S. military contingent in Israel to oversee a grant program. Since 1974, some or all of U.S. military aid to Israel has been in the form of loans for which repayment is waived. A loan in which repayment is waived is a grant, but because the law says that grants have to be supervised, they just reworded it and then they changed the terms. So technically, the assistance is called loans, but as a practical matter, the military aid is grant. Israel now receives on average about $3 billion in direct foreign assistance each year. And remember that whenever they tell you that they're so powerful and they've got this great tech sector, and ask them where all that money came from originally to get all of this started. It didn't come from them originally. It came from Jews around the world, but a lot of it came from the United States as well, directly from the government. Israel now receives on average, about $3 billion in direct foreign assistance each year, an amount that is roughly 1/6 of America's direct foreign assistance budget and equal to about 2% of Israel's GDP. In recent years, about 75% of U.S. assistance has been military aid, with the remainder broken down into various forms of economic aid. In per capita terms, this level of direct foreign assistance amounts to a direct subsidy of more than $500 per year for each Israeli. By comparison, the number 2 recipient of American foreign aid, Egypt, receives only $20 per person. And impoverished countries such as Pakistan and Haiti receive roughly $5 per person and $27 per person, respectively. Imagine that. Haiti, the conditions that they're in, imposed by France and the United States over many, many years, they get $27 per person, but Israel gets $500 per person. Jerusalem and Washington agreed to gradually phase out economic assistance beginning in 1997, and Congress has reduced economic aid to Israel by $120 million per year since fiscal year 1999. This step has been partly compensated for by a parallel U.S. commitment to increase its military aid by $60 million per year, and by congressional willingness to vote supplemental aid packages, such as the $1.2 billion provided to support implementation of the 1998 Y Agreement, in which Israel agreed to withdraw forces from parts of the West Bank, and an additional $1 billion in foreign military financing aid in 2003 to help Israel prepare for the war with Iraq. So we're going to reduce it by $120 million per year, but we're going to give $1.2 billion here and $1 billion there. And you see that the $120 million reduction per year is a joke. $3 billion per year is generous, but it is hardly the whole story. As noted above, the canonical $3 billion figure omits a substantial number of other benefits and thus significantly understates the actual level of U.S. support. Indeed, in 1991, Representative Lee Hamilton told reporters that Israel was one of 3 countries whose aid substantially exceeds the popularly quoted figures, and said the annual figure was in fact more than $4.3 billion. The discrepancy arises in part because Israel gets its aid under more favorable terms than most other recipients of U.S. assistance. Most recipients of American foreign aid get their money in quarterly installments, but since 1982, the annual foreign aid bill has included a special clause specifying that Israel is to receive its entire annual appropriation in the first 30 days of the fiscal year. This is akin to receiving your entire annual salary on January 1st and thus being able to earn interest on the unspent portion until you use it. Because the U.S. government normally runs budget deficits, transferring the aid all at once requires it to borrow the necessary amount of money up front. And the CRS estimates that it costs U.S. taxpayers between $50 and $60 million per year to borrow funds for the early lump sum payment. Do you understand what I'm saying? Israel has a special clause in which, unlike every other country who gets their money in quarterly installments, they must get it all up front in the first 30 days of the fiscal year. Since we don't have that money, we have to pay to borrow it. So we have to pay to borrow money to give Israel all the money at the beginning of the year. You can't make it up. Moreover, the U.S. government ends up paying Israel additional interest when Israel reinvests the unspent portion in U.S. Treasury bills. According to the U.S. Embassy in Israel, early transfer of FMF funds has enabled Israel to earn some $660 million in extra interest as of 2004. Now, it's not that surprising that the Israelis are good with money, right? But they're going to take the money that we loan them, that we had to take out a loan, we had to pay interest on that. We give it to them. They then invest it in U.S. treasuries and then get interest payments to the tune of $660 billion. Israel has also received excess defense articles, i.e. surplus U.S. military equipment provided to friendly nations either free of charge or heavily discounted, beyond the normal limits imposed by the 1976 Arms Export Control Act. This limit was originally set at $250 million, excluding ships, but the Appropriations Bill of November 5, 1990, authorized a, quote, one-time only transfer to Israel of $700 million worth of surplus U.S. equipment in 1991. And that is just one example for 1 year. Likewise, the FMF program normally requires recipients of U.S. military assistance to spend all of the money here in the United States to help keep American defense workers employed. You know what's coming, right? Congress grants Israel a special exemption in the annual appropriations bill, however, authorizing it to use about 1 out of every 4 U.S. military aid dollars to subsidize its own defense industry, its own competing defense industry. No other recipient of U.S. military assistance has been granted this benefit, notes a recent CRS report, and the proceeds to Israeli defense firms from purchases with U.S. funds have allowed the Israeli defense industry to achieve necessary economies of scale and become highly sophisticated. By 2004, in fact, Israel, a comparatively small country, had become the world's 8th largest arms supplier. And if you want to know more about the Israeli weapons industry, you can see my review on the Palestine Laboratory by Anthony Lowenstein. I'll put a card to that review above. Along with Egypt and Turkey, Israel is also permitted to apply its entire FMF funding to meet its current year obligations, rather than having to set aside portions to cover expected costs in subsequent years. According to the U.S. General Accounting Office, this cash flow method of financing permits a country to order more defense goods and services than it normally could because less money must be reserved when a contract is signed. Israel can make its payments as long as the United States continues to provide similar amounts of aid, a situation that makes it harder for the United States to reduce its support in the future. And in a further manipulation of the methods of financing, recipients of U.S. aid are normally expected to draw down FMF loans and grants at an equal rate, but Israel is allowed to draw down the grant or waived portions of its FMF allocation before it uses any loaned portions. By delaying the date on which the loan is activated, this procedure reduces the amount of interest that Israel owes Uncle Sam. Remarkably, Israel is the only recipient of U.S. economic aid. Isn't that remarkable? That does not have to account for how it is spent. Aid to other countries is allocated for specific development projects: HIV/AIDS prevention, counter-narcotics programs, children's health, democracy promotion, education improvement, etc. But Israel receives a direct lump sum transfer. This exemption makes it virtually impossible for the United States to prevent its subsidies from being used for purposes that it opposes, such as building settlements on the West Bank. According to the CRS's Clyde Mark, because U.S. economic aid is given to Israel as direct government-to-government budgetary authority without any specific project accounting, and money is fungible, there is no way to tell how Israel uses U.S. aid. Another form of U.S. support is loan guarantees that permit Israel to borrow money from commercial banks at lower rates, thereby saving millions of dollars in interest payments. Israel requested and received approximately $10 billion in loan guarantees from the United States in the early 1990s in order to finance the costs of settling Soviet Jews immigrating to Israel. The U.S. government does not provide funds directly in a loan guarantee, it merely undertakes to reimburse private lenders in the event of a default. And advocates of these measures often claim that there is no real expenditure and thus no real cost to the U.S. taxpayer. Loan guarantees do have budgetary consequences, however, because Congress must appropriate funds to cover an estimate of what could be lost over the life of the loan based on its net present value. Estimates for the cost of the 1992 loan guarantee range from $100 million to $800 million. I know I can't keep up with the numbers. I'm just reading this out to you, okay? Washington authorized the second round of loan guarantees in 2003, totaling nearly $9 billion, to help Israel prepare for the war with Iraq, deal with protracted economic crisis, and cover the costs imposed by the Second Palestinian Intifada. I mean, this is a joke. Israel prepared for the war with Iraq? What, Israel was part of the ground invasion of Iraq? This is just fear-mongering, said we're going to need to prepare for the war in Iraq. Actually, we're just going to use this to strengthen our military so that we can bomb men, women, and children. Because Israel is legally barred from using U.S. economic aid in the occupied territories, the actual amount allocated was eventually reduced by an amount equivalent to Israel's estimated expenditures on settlement construction. This reduction is not as severe as it may sound, however, as it involved no decrease in direct U.S. aid and merely forced Israel to pay a slightly higher interest rate on a small portion of the borrowed funds. In addition to government subsidized aid and loan guarantees, Israel receives an estimated $2 billion annually in private donations from American citizens, roughly half in direct payments and half via the purchase of State of Israel bonds. These bonds receive favorable treatment in U.S. law. What a surprise! Although the interest paid on them is not tax-exempt, Congress specifically exempted them from the provisions of the 1984 Deficit Reduction Act, which imposed additional tax penalties on other bonds with yields below the federal rate. Similarly, private donations to charities in most foreign countries are not tax-deductible, but many private donations to Israel are, due to a special clause in the U.S.-Israel Income Tax Treaty. Special treatment, special treatment, special treatment, special treatment, and the question has to be why? Why is Israel more special than any other country in the world? And the answer is, they've got a great lobby. They've got a great lobby, and they're great at making it clear that they are the people imposed on when they say that they're the victims when they are the great victimizers, actually. Kissinger complained at one point during the negotiations, I ask Rabin to make concessions, and he says he can't because Israel is weak. So I give him more arms, and then he says he doesn't need to make concessions because Israel is strong. Play the victim, get what you want, then say we don't have to listen to you anyway. Right? So takeaway number one, the lobby exists. It's not a conspiracy theory. Takeaway number two, without U.S. aid, Israel will be forced to make peace with its neighbors and live within its means economically. They wouldn't have this giant money flow all the time, enabling them to do whatever they want. They don't have the money to do what they do. They only have it because of all of these special guarantees and ways that they can get money from the rest of the world and from the United States. Without it, they'd have to make their way like everyone else does in the world. Third takeaway, Israel does not adhere to international law. So remember, they're always going to tell you that the only democracy in the Middle East. Do we define democracies as entities that do not adhere to international law? If so, then Israel doesn't qualify. We knew that in 2007 when the book was published. We certainly know that in 2024 when Israel attacks the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, because remember, Zionists do not allow themselves to be criticized, and they do not have any ability to criticize themselves. So when anyone criticizes them or anyone accuses them of wrongdoing, it means that they're anti-Semitic. And we'll get to the label anti-Semitic at some point later. But Israel holds itself above international law. And part of this is the theory that the whole world is anti-Semitic, so we have to go our own way anyway, and we don't care what anyone says about us. That's part of it. But Israel does not adhere to international law. There are facts over and over and over regarding this. In addition to its nuclear arsenal, Israel maintains active chemical and biological weapons and has yet to ratify either the Chemical or Biological Weapons Convention. Does that sound like a democracy to you? The irony is hard to miss. The United States has pressured many other states to join the NPT, that's the Non-Proliferation Treaty, imposed sanctions on countries that have defied U.S. wishes and acquired nuclear weapons anyway, gone to war in 2003 to prevent Iraq from pursuing WMD, which didn't exist, and contemplated attacking Iran and North Korea for the same reason. Yet Washington has long subsidized an ally whose clandestine WMD activities are well known and whose nuclear arsenal has given several of its neighbors a powerful incentive to seek WMD themselves. It's a reason that Pakistan and India sought this. They thought, I have an enemy, and I'm not getting into who's right or wrong there, but it makes sense. If you have an enemy that is going to acquire weapons, you are going to want to acquire them as well. Why is it that big of a surprise that Iran, knowing that it's being targeted by Israel, would want to acquire their own weapons? With the partial exception of Soviet support for Cuba, it is hard to think of another instance where one country has provided another with a similar level of material aid over such an extended period. America's willingness to provide some support to Israel is not surprising, of course, because U.S. leaders have long favored Israel's existence. As discussed below and in Chapter 2, U.S. leaders also saw aid to Israel as a way to advance broader foreign policy goals. So, Israel does not adhere to international law, and the U.S. is okay with it because you have to keep in mind the U.S. doesn't really adhere to international law itself. It picks and chooses when it wants to. It criticizes people for interfering in elections. There's no country that interferes with elections more than the United States. It criticizes regimes for stifling free speech. We do that in the United States. So we are some of the biggest hypocrites, quite possibly the biggest hypocrites. I don't think that's even disputable. But we accuse people of crimes that we commit. We assassinate leaders, we bomb civilians. So I'm just going to talk about one particular case. Some people may know about it already, others may not. But I'm just going to focus on one example of how Israel gets itself out of being accountable to international law. In the last 3 days of the recent Lebanon war, so this would have been in 2006, when a ceasefire was known to be imminent, the IDF fired over 1 million bomblets into southern Lebanon, which has a population of 650,000. The aim was to saturate the area with these small but deadly bombs. One Israeli soldier in an artillery battalion said, "In the last 72 hours, we fired all the munitions we had, all at the same spot. We didn't even alter the direction of the gun. Friends of mine in the battalion told me they also fired everything in the last 3 days, ordinary shells, clusters, whatever they had. Over the course of the entire war, the IDF is estimated to have fired roughly 4 million bomblets into Lebanon. When the fighting finally stopped in mid-August, UN officials estimated that there were about 1 million unexploded bomblets in the southern part of the country. If you're not familiar with bomblets, it's these smaller bombs which can remain unexploded, and then let's say a kid comes across them 2 months later and it explodes and it kills that child. Researchers from Human Rights Watch said that the density of cluster bombs in southern Lebanon was higher than in any place they had seen. One Israeli soldier who helped flood the area with cluster bombs said, "What we did was insane and monstrous. We covered entire towns in cluster bombs." Conspiracy theory? Anti-Semitic? This is a quote from an IDF soldier. Jan Egeland, the UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, labeled Israel's actions shocking and completely immoral. In the first 8 months after the war, 29 Lebanese were killed by cluster bombs and another 215 were injured, 90 of them children. And obviously we're talking about Israel, but if you'd like to learn more about Lebanon and how it's affected by bordering Israel, I'll put a link to a video that I did on Lebanon as a card. So now that they've committed this war crime, what did they do? The lobby went to work to limit the damage from the cluster bomb controversy. On August the 31st, B'nai B'rith International sent a letter to Jan Egeland, the UN leader who had criticized Israel's use of cluster bombs, accusing him of acting as an unappointed moral arbiter with regard to disputed, unproven facts on the ground. Soldiers were testifying that it happened. It's not an undisputed fact on the ground. The interpretation of international humanitarian law. It's not an interpretation. It's immoral to use cluster bombs. It's been settled in international law and by civilized countries. A week later, the Senate was debating legislation that would ban the use of cluster bombs in civilian areas and prohibit the transfer of those deadly weapons to countries that refused to accept that ban. Sounds reasonable, right? AIPAC lobbied hard against the legislation, which went down to defeat by a vote of 70 to 30. As I said, you cannot make it up. You cannot make up the chutzpah involved in doing what Israel does. And they have no remorse. They have no hesitation about doing this because they are special. They are set aside, and everyone else is really just here to serve them. So, what is the fourth takeaway that I want you to think about today? Israel is a strategic liability to the U.S. in the Middle East, and it's a danger to the region as a whole. Claiming that Israel and the United States are united by a shared terrorist threat has the causal relationship backward. The United States did not form an alliance with Israel because it suddenly realized that it faced a serious danger from global terrorism and urgently needed Israel's help to defeat it. In fact, the United States has a terrorism problem in good part because it has so long been supportive of Israel. It is hardly headline news to observe that U.S. backing for Israel is unpopular elsewhere in the Middle East. That has been true for several decades, but many people may not realize how America's one-sided policies have cost it over the years. Not only have these policies helped inspire Al-Qaeda, but they have also facilitated its recruitment efforts and contributed to growing anti-Americanism throughout the region. It's as Professors Mearsheimer and Walt note, it's exactly the opposite. We don't need Israel's help to fight terrorism. Israel is the reason why there is terrorism. Israel has caused it, firstly, by their own terrorism towards other people. They have fostered terrorism in response. And terrorism, but also legitimate resistance. If the United States could live with a nuclear Soviet Union or a nuclear China, whose former leaders were among the greatest mass murderers the world has ever known, and if it can tolerate a nuclear Pakistan and embrace a nuclear India, then it could live, however reluctantly, with a nuclear Iran as well. Why is Israel allowed to have nuclear weapons, but Iran is not? It's a fair question. And I'm going to give one example here about Israel being a strategic problem in relation to how the U.S. is trying to deal with Iran. And again, this is just one example from a 2007 book. There's been many examples since then. In April 1995, AIPAC issued a report entitled Comprehensive U.S. Sanctions Against Iran, A Plan for Action. By that point, however, steps were already being taken to tighten the economic noose around Iran's neck. Senator Alphonse D'Amato, with some help from the Israelis, introduced legislation in January 1995 to end all economic links between the United States and Iran. The Clinton administration opposed the legislation at first, and it stalled in Congress. But 2 months later, groups in the lobby achieved their first success after Iran chose Conoco, an American oil company, to develop the Syri oil fields. Iran deliberately selected Conoco over several other foreign bidders in order to signal its interest in improving relations with the United States. But this friendly overture went nowhere because Clinton killed the deal on March the 14th. 1 day later, he issued an executive order banning American companies from helping Iran develop its oil fields. Clinton later said that one of the most effective opponents of the Conoco deal was Edgar Bronfman Sr., the powerful former head of the World Jewish Congress. AIPAC also played a key role in scuttling that deal. Remember, Clinton originally was fine with this, and then he was told what he was allowed to do, and he did it. On May the 6th, the president issued a second executive order banning all trade and financial investments with Iran, which he labeled an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. How? How is Iran an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States? And again, this was in 1995. Where are all the attacks that Iran has thrown against the United States? Clinton had actually announced that he was going to take that step 1 week earlier in a speech to the World Jewish Congress. His decision to nix the Conoco deal and issue those 2 executive orders was, notes Pollack, a major demonstration of our support for Israel. Ironically, though, Israel lay behind the American decision to cut economic ties to Iran. Israel did not pass any laws barring Israeli-Iranian trade, and Israelis continued to purchase Iranian goods through third parties. Again, rules for them, we get to do whatever we want. But those executive orders were not enough for the lobby, because executive orders could be quickly reversed if Clinton ever changed his mind. A.M. Rosenthal, a strong defender of Israel, made this point in a New York Times column in which he criticized the Conoco deal. The only problem with executive orders is that the president giveth, what the president giveth he can canceleth. In response to this potential problem, Trita Parsi reports that on its own initiative, AIPAC revised the bill that Senator D'Amato had introduced in January 1995 and convinced the New York senator to reintroduce it in 1996 with AIPAC's proposed changes. The new bill, which eventually became the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, imposed sanctions on any foreign companies investing more than $40 million to develop petroleum resources in Iran or Libya. Although the proposed legislation infuriated America's European allies, the House passed it by a vote of 415 to 0 on June the 19th, 1996, and the Senate passed it by unanimous consent 1 month later. Clinton signed the bill on August the 5th, even though there was significant opposition to the new legislation throughout the administration. Indeed, Kenneth Pollock wrote that much of the executive branch hated the D'Amato bill. In fact, for many, hated was too mild a word. However, many of President Clinton's domestic policy advisors thought it would be sheer stupidity for the White House not to endorse the bill. Since Clinton was up for re-election in 3 months, they were probably right. As Zeev Schiff, the military correspondent for Haaretz, noted at the time, Israel is but a tiny element in the big scheme, but one that should not conclude that it cannot influence those within the Beltway. Similarly, James Schlesinger, who has held a number of cabinet-level positions in different administrations, remarked in the wake of these sanctions, "It is scarcely possible to overstate the influence of Israel supporters on our policies in the Middle East." The Conoco episode casts further doubt on the oft-repeated claim that the oil lobby is the real hidden hand behind U.S. Middle East policy. In this case, an American oil company wanted to deal with Iran, and Iran wanted to do business with it. The oil industry was opposed to overturning the Conoco deal, and it also opposed the legislation to impose sanctions on Iran. As noted in Chapter 4, Dick Cheney, a prominent advocate of confronting Iran today, publicly opposed the U.S. sanctions program when he was president of the oil services company Halliburton in the 1990s. But oil interests were steamrolled by AIPAC on every decision. These outcomes provide more evidence of how little influence the oil companies have on U.S. Middle East policy when compared with Israel and the lobby. And the final takeaway is the idea, and it was true in 2007 when this book came out, but it's very true today, especially since October of 2023. Anti-Semitism, as a phrase, as an accusation, no longer holds any meaning or scares anyone because everyone's been called it now and they realize it doesn't mean anything. What it used to mean, it still means this, but what it used to mean was anyone who opposes policy positions of Israel. So, for example, if Israel believes in their military wearing purple shirts, if you say that's a bad idea, that would make you anti Semitic because you were opposing an Israeli idea, an Israeli policy. But this is crazy, of course. And that's why today the label anti Semitic doesn't mean anything. When you've overused it and overused it and overused it and overplayed your hand, you make people not afraid anymore of being called that because they know who they are and they know how they feel and they know that they don't hate any specific race. They just don't like one particular group of people taking advantage of everyone else and then pretending that's not taking advantage of everyone else and then them calling everyone else names because they've been exposed. Until recently, therefore, the charge of anti-Semitism has been a potent way to make sure that criticisms of Israel or the lobby were rarely spoken and were either ignored or disparaged when they were. The accusation is likely to resonate among American Jews, many of whom still believe that anti-Semitism is rife. Not only does the history of Jews in the diaspora provide plenty of cause to worry, that tendency is magnified by the role the Holocaust plays in the attitudes of a significant number of Jewish Americans. As Peter Novick makes clear in his seminal book, The Holocaust in American Life, that cataclysmic event has become a key element of American Jewish consciousness. It defines how many American Jews think about the world around them, and not surprisingly, it has fostered a powerful sense of victimization for some of them. Despite the great success Jews have achieved in America, many Jewish Americans still worry that virulent anti-Semitism could return at any time. As J.Mearsheimer notes, by virtually any measure, domestic anti-Semitism has declined sharply. However, many American Jews continue to believe that other Jews in the United States are targets of bigotry. Frank Rich, the New York Times columnist, acknowledges this thinking when he writes, "Like many other Jews, I am perhaps all too willing to believe that the entire world is anti-Semitic. And when you have such an attitude, then you do what you want because everyone's against you anyway." And that is the attitude in Israel. This profound sense of fear among American Jews was clearly evident when Israel was harshly criticized around the world in the spring of 2002. Nat Hentoff, who writes for the Village Voice, remarked at the time that if a loudspeaker goes off and a voice says all Jews gather in Times Square, it could never surprise me. I mean, come on. And the New York Observer's Ron Rosenbaum warned American Jews that a second Holocaust against Israel was likely. I mean, this is just such nonsense. These concerns grew so loud that Leon Wieseltier of the New Republic, himself a deeply committed defender of Israel, felt compelled to write a cover story titled "Hitler is Dead, the Case Against Jewish Ethnic Panic." Describing Jews in the United States, he wrote, "The community is sunk in excitability, in the imagination of disaster. There is a loss of intellectual control. Death is at every Jewish door. Fear is wild. Reason is derailed. Anxiety is the supreme proof of authenticity. So if I'm anxious, that means it's true." Imprecise and inflammatory analogies abound. Holocaust imagery is everywhere. Does this sound familiar? In short, many American Jews find it easy to believe that a person who criticizes either Israel's actions or the influence of groups like AIPAC is probably an anti-Semite at heart, because Israel can't possibly do anything wrong. That's why it can't be criticized. For all these reasons, when faced with criticism of Israel's policies, some of its defenders are quick to invoke the charge of anti-Semitism. The first and most visible case is the heated reaction to Jimmy Carter's recent book, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. I have a review for that book. I'll put a card to that as well. Despite its provocative title, the book is neither polemical nor unsympathetic to Israel's strategic situation. Carter is certainly critical of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and what that means for the Palestinians living there, and he correctly observes that it is difficult to have a candid discussion of these issues in the United States. But as Yossi Beilin, a prominent Israeli politician, noted, there is nothing in the criticism that Carter has for Israel that has not been said by the Israelis themselves. Even Carter's use of the term apartheid, which seems to have provoked much of the ire directed at him, echoes the use of the term by Israeli critics of the occupation and by prominent South Africans such as Nobel Peace Prize winner Bishop Desmond Tutu and current Minister of Intelligence Ronnie Kasrils. And obviously, since 2007, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, a number of prominent organizations and governments have referred to apartheid. And that's just a reality. So, the Israel lobby in U.S. foreign policy, the 5 key takeaways. Again, the lobby exists. It is not a conspiracy theory. Number 2, without the United States, Israel will be forced to make peace with its neighbors and be forced to live within its own economic means and actually live a realistic life instead of just promising lies to everybody and continuing to build settlements indefinitely because they have all this free money from the United States. Israel does not adhere to international law, and the United States backs them in this flouting of international law. That's number 3. Number 4, Israel is a strategic liability to the United States in the Middle East, and it's a danger to the region in general. And finally, anti-Semitism is now meaningless as a phrase because it's been made so by the Israel lobby. So if you liked what you heard today, if you think that this could be helpful to someone who's open-minded enough to hear criticism of Israel, hit like, share this, subscribe to the channel, and you can buy a copy of the book. That's another way you can support the channel, through the description below. And you'll also see links to other reviews that I've done, not only on this channel, but on the channel, my original books review channel, in which I started studying this last year. A reminder that a portion of proceeds from all the different ways that the Palestine Bookshelf gets money, it will go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which is an organization that helps children get medical care, Palestinian children get medical care who would not otherwise be able to get that. As always, enjoy your reading.